To establish a continuity for the video, because Sonic has like 1,000 different iterations on this IP, we're going to be going over game canon, starting with Sonic the Hedgehog. As the timeline on the screen shows, after Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the timeline splits, one where the Time Eater appears, and the other one where the Time Eater does not appear. That timeline continues and we get Sonic 4, tons of games in between it, and the modern perspective of Sonic Generations, which leads to Sonic's Lost World, Sonic Forces, then stops at Sonic Mania Adventures. Then for the one where the Time Eater does appear, it gets a lot more simple. We get the classic perspective of Sonic Generations, then into Sonic Mania, which leads into Forces, and then stops at Sonic Mania Adventures. To state the obvious, I'm not going to be bringing up every single feat from all of these games, as I'd be here for hours. Just the more important ones to his scaling and how he progresses or regresses in power throughout the different games. The games with Sonic's arguably greatest feats are Sonic and the Secret Rings, Sonic 06, as terrible as it is, Sonic Generations, and Sonic Forces. So we're going to be focusing mainly on those for the majority of this video. Now, obviously, if you just looked at my channel, I don't normally do any Sonic type content. So I can't say I'll ever do this again, but I don't know, if you like it, like the video, and you know, you can subscribe, but I'm probably never going to do something like this again. But let's get started. The first piece of scaling I'm going to cover is a fairly obscure speed statement for classic Sonic, which would apply to both ends of the timeline presented earlier. In the Japanese version of the Sonic CD manual, there's a page describing the time warp ability, which is the ability Sonic uses to travel throughout time in this game. The description for this tells us that Sonic needs to run at and maintain light speed for a brief period in order to perform this ability. Now, you could push this as to be an immeasurable speed feat if you wanted to, but it wouldn't exactly be consistent. This same description also implies Sonic needs to run across future and past signs in order to actually initiate this time travel process, indicating that he can't do it on his own, obviously. Sonic 06 also has Sonic and his friends needing time portals to travel throughout time, despite the fact that they should all be faster than Sonic was back in Sonic CD. So ultimately, it's more consistent to say that this is just a light speed feat. For a feat so early on in Sonic's history though, this is quite impressive, especially considering that Sonic gets way faster after this game. Now I'm going to dive into the more significant scaling from the 4 games I highlighted at the beginning. I'll start with Sonic 06 since this game came out before the other ones that I mentioned. This game, while it is awful, this has some of the best scaling out of literally all the Sonic games. This mainly comes from Sonic's fight with Solaris, who has a decent amount of statements I have to get into to scale him properly. In the cutscene before they set out to revive Sonic, Eggman talks about how Solaris consuming timelines and how he's a transcendent life form that exists in the past, present, and future. This gets reinforced by the Sonic 06 Prima Games guide, which basically describes Solaris as having the ability to transform everything into nothing, and states that his second form has the power to destroy time and space itself. The recent Sonic the Hedgehog Encyclopedia, that's actually what it's called by the way, not kidding, also tells us that Solaris was destroying all space-time. In the fight itself, Solaris is stated to be a super-dimensional being multiple times, and I don't want to get into the semantics of this, but to put it simply, that term essentially means beyond dimensions. Sonic of course is scaled to this as he literally defeats Solaris alongside Shadow and Silver. The Prima guy has a statement talking about how Sonic is the only one strong enough to put down Solaris permanently, which should further establish that he should scale this high. This would mean that he is at least low multiversal to arguably 5D, depending on how you interpret the super dimensional statement. Low multiversal would be a given, seeing as the big feat happening in this game is the destruction of all space-time, which included the destruction of multiple timelines. If you interpret the super dimensional statement to mean he's beyond 4D space-times, then obviously he'd be 5D if he's a step above that. Sonic, however, wouldn't exactly scale to this when you consider the grander context of this fight. The fight is separated into 2 phases. The first phase has Eggman point out that despite being super dimensional, Solaris should be anchored to their dimension because of the light shells on his body. This would mean Solaris was dragged down by an entire dimensional tier in the beginning. In phase 2, after destroying these shells, Eggman is questioning if it's even possible to defeat a supernatural being, and says that even if you can't stop his physical form, they can destroy his consciousness. So if you push Solaris to 5D, it wouldn't really make sense to scale Sonic to 5D considering these statements, but he would need to have 5D mental attacks in order to attack the mindscape of Solaris. I can kind of see it going either way, so it's up to you where you will interpret this to scale. Before moving on to the next game, I want to quickly mention Sonic's speed scaling here. This fight with Solaris pretty much requires Sonic to have immeasurable speed in some fashion. Immeasurable speed being a level of speed that breaks the speed formula since you're so fast that you can go forward or backward in time. As we know, Solaris existed in the past, present, and future as stated earlier, and needed to be defeated in all 3 time periods in order to be beaten. Obviously, Solaris was defeated permanently, so with this in mind, you can interpret the narrative of the fight in 1 or 2 ways. The first of which being that 2 of the 3 hedgehogs traveled to different time periods at the beginning, while 1 remained in the present. Using this interpretation, you could say Sonic doesn't actually perform the feat, but that would be irrelevant since he's already faster than both Shadow and Silver anyway, so the scaling would apply regardless. The other way to interpret this is to say that each hedgehog flies throughout time during the battle. Under this interpretation, Sonic would also be performing the feat as well, so there's no room for any skepticism there. A somewhat common counter argument to this line of scaling is that it's possible the time travel was done through hacks, and I don't seem that to be very likely here. Throughout this game, they go out of their way to show that time portals being made through chaos control when characters time travel. So for this ritual to be absent during this battle and the cutscene prior indicate to me that it wasn't used, but whatever. Now onto Sonic and the Secret Rings. This game is also fairly popular in terms of being known for having powerful scaling implications. This would mainly come from the end of the game where you see Sonic use his Dark Spine form to take on the transformed Azar Jin, otherwise known as Alphalelo Alela. The grander lore of this game doesn't extrapolate too much on how strong these forms are, but Alphalelo Alela does make a few useful statements we can use to scale him. He implies that he is the embodiment of the Abraham Knight's reality and would remake that world and all reality in his image. Keep in mind that Eraser intentionally intended to usurp the power from the World Rings and attempt to take over Sonic's universe, so he's at least aware of the 2 different realms. Considering that the Arabian Nights contains a realm of infinite size, it should be easy to tell how impressive he would be for recreating the realm alongside the rest of reality. You could push it a bit further and say it's possible he's aware of other universes aside from Sonic's main universe, which would make the statement more impressive, but it's up to your interpretation. Regarding the speed scaling for this game, not much really implies Dark Spine Sonic is much faster than Sonic's base, so there's really nothing to say there. Sonic Generations probably has the most straightforward scaling of any of the games I'll mention. Sonic's relevant feat in this game is taking on the Time Eater alongside his classic counterpart. We learned that the Time Eater is capable of destroying and erasing space-time, and he does this throughout the game and drag different time periods into the white space. The Sonic Encyclopedia, as I mentioned earlier, even implies that the Time Eater was destroying all of time as well. Like I said, this is very straightforward, scaling the Time Eater to at least low multiversal, but can be way higher if applied to the aforementioned 5D scaling from Solaris. For speed scaling, it's also very straightforward. The Time Eater's whole shtick is moving through time, and the Encyclopedia says that Sonic flies through the end of time to fight it at the end of the game. And now we finally got into the Sonic Forces portion of the video. This game has quite controversial scaling, which to properly dive into, I need to first talk about Sonic Mania, which takes place in the classic Sonic side of the timeline, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. In Sonic Mania, we see the first appearance of the Phantom Ruby and its reality bending abilities. It's capable of warping space and time to launch different beings into different eras. Eggman uses it to send classic Sonic to the Stardust Speedway, which is a bit crazy when you consider the green aesthetic, which indicates this is the Stardust Speedway of the far past. This design shows up as Sonic CD. When you go to the past in this zone, and the Mania Classic Sonic even uses Time Warp to go back to the future to counteract what Eggman did to him previously. It also seems to be capable of creating dimensions where time does not flow linearly, as the timer in the Egg or Very Zone jumps forward and backward in time during the cutscenes that take place here. Keep in mind that Eggman experienced these powers within hours of discovering the Phantom Ruby. In Sonic Forces, the Phantom Ruby brings itself to modern Sonic's dimension, and the modern Eggman discovers an experience on it for months on end. This leads us to the controversial scaling for this game, which mainly comes from Eggman making statements implying Infinite and the Phantom Ruby are more powerful than anything he had previously made, and even the official Sonic the Hedgehog website cites Infinite as Sonic's most powerful enemy yet. Of course, like most villains in the franchise, Infinite eventually loses to Sonic alongside the CAC character meant to represent the player in this boss fight at the end of the game. While this scaling may not be clear cut, there's a common contention in the fact that despite these statements, Infinite is defeated by base Sonic, which is argued to be a blatant contradiction to Infinite surpassing his enemies like Solaris or the Time Eater, but you can resolve this contradiction in a few ways. We know Sonic gets stronger over time, and even in this game, Sonic says he gets stronger every second. You could use this by itself to say that Sonic passively grew a lot stronger in this game to eventually surpass Infinite in his base to resolve this contradiction. You could argue Sonic has made comparable jumps in strength in base before, like in Sonic Generations. In the Xbox and PS3 versions of the game, Sonic is able to defeat Perfect Chaos, who previously needed his super form to beat in the original Sonic Adventure. In the 3DS version of the Sonic game, Sonic takes on the Bio Lizard instead, and after beating it, he says it was way easy to beat him because he had fought him before, though Sonic had only fought the Bio Lizard in his super form in Sonic Adventure 2. All three versions ultimately portray the idea that Sonic's base in the future can surpass his super form from the past, so it's not entirely impossible for Sonic to have gotten that much stronger by the end of Sonic Forces. Another way to resolve this contradiction is to simply say that Infinite was weakened in his final battle with Sonic. When Sonic and Infinite have their initial rematch, we see that Infinite still has the advantage over him since he can still overpower a stronger Sonic while holding back and doesn't even consider Sonic worthy of killing and leaves him despite knowing he can grow stronger. Some use this scene to say Infinite ducked Sonic out of fear or something, but this doesn't make sense because of what happens after this. After this, Sonic and all his friends resolve to weaken the Phantom Ruby, since in their head, this was the only way for them to actually win, which wouldn't make sense if Sonic had actually surpassed Infinite by this point. After weakening the Phantom Ruby by destroying one of his power generators, and Infinite creating this small sun, Tails makes a statement saying that their last chance to defeat Infinite was in this super weakened state. In case anyone wants to know how creating a small sun could weaken a character I'm saying should scale over low multiversal to maybe 5D levels of power at his peak, I'll point out that this should showcase how much power the initial generator was giving the Phantom Ruby. Even if you completely ignore the scaling over previous characters, we know the Phantom Ruby can create null space, when it's not weakened of course, which is a realm that can contain a multitude of stars inside of it, and is possibly infinite in size if you take the literal interpretation of this statement, which describes the realm as an endless void. I hope that clears any doubt regarding that, but now let's return to the Infinite was weakened argument. While Infinite does regain energy after creating the small sun, this obviously doesn't resolve the issue that the first generator was still destroyed, so he'd obviously still be weakened, so Sonic defeating after that point wouldn't really scale him anywhere. The third way you can resolve this contradiction is by saying that Sonic had an amp akin to something like the Will of Fire mental amp from Naruto. When Sonic and the avatar character you make in the game defeat Infinite for the final time, he says that heart, soul, and the bonds of friendship can't be defeated, and that this was a power of 3 that Infinite did not have. Now for most people, I doubt this would be the most convincing evidence on its own, but this notion of friendship amps and similar power boost appears in other Sonic games. In Sonic Rush, Eggman and Eggman Nega drain the soul emeralds of their complete energy. After this, Sonic tells Blaze that as long as you have the power of friendship, the soul emeralds will never lose their glow, which leads to the emeralds regaining their energy. Team Sonic Racing, which came out after Sonic Forces, has an entire plotline dedicated to the teamwork being an energy source that's used to power up something called the Ultimate Energy Machine. This example is very explicit, and there's not much room to twist this as hyperbole or anything like that. This being featured in a modern Sonic game after Forces should also tell us that they are trying to flesh out this concept and it wasn't some one-off thing. Teamwork as a sort of power is also used in Sonic Heroes, as Sonic mentions the power of teamwork or superpower of teamwork a few times in the game. The Encyclopedia also directly references the power of teamwork twice to my knowledge. One instance is when they describe the Egg Emperor boss fight in the 3DS version of the Sonic Generations game, where it says that Sonic must do without the superpower of teamwork when facing the Egg Emperor alone, which obviously implies Sonic did not have this power the first time he fought this, which was in Sonic Heroes. The second instance is in this description of null space I talked about earlier, which tells us that Sonic and the player avatar character broke out of this realm with the real superpower of teamwork. I think that you get the point by now that the main theme is very prominent throughout the series. Now do keep in mind that none of these resolutions I presented are mutually exclusive by any means. They can all be true simultaneously depending on what you accept. It's either base Sonic does scale to low multiversal to 5D levels of power by himself, Sonic only scales to this with teamwork amps, or that Sonic simply does not scale to this level at all due to Infinite being weakened. Once again, it's all up to you to decide what makes the most sense in your mind. But that's all for this video. Like I said at the beginning, this one is more random, it's kind of out there, but I'm literally just never going to mention the context and why this video was made. The only way you could ever get that information is if you were to tune into streams regularly, which I'll leave that secret for there, and that's it. But other than that, have a nice day.